Welcome, welcome. Okay, happy Wednesday, everybody. Glad to see you all back, figuratively anyway. So plan for today, we are going to review a little bit of the first part of chapter 10 at the beginning. So we're gonna do a Kahoot quiz the first half of chapter 10, and then we're going to finish the lecture for chapter 10 and then put that one behind us, okay? So the last thing we have to do over the course of the semester, lecture-wise, is finish, what would that be? Chapter 13. Okay, so chapter 13 is abnormal psych. So that's psychological disorders. We're talking a lot about like OCD and anxiety disorders and depressive disorders and things like that. It's very interesting, or at least I think it is. And if you keep on wanting to study psychology, you'll take at least one more abnormal psych focused class. But we are going to finish up personality today. We're going to talk about personality assessments a good bit. We talked about that a little bit already, but we're going to talk about the pros and cons of different types of assessment. I'm trying to think what else. So we're going to take our Kahoot, we'll take a break, then we'll come back, finish chapter 10. Will be part of our sprint to the finish, because between now and the end of the semester, we still have another assignment, which I will talk about probably tomorrow. It's just a works cited, so it's nothing super involved, but practicing doing those. So that will probably be your assignment for Sunday. Shouldn't take too long. You're just finding sources. I may make a little extra video to help guide you guys through that. Let's see what else. We have a paper that will be due on the day of the exam. We have an exam. We have a third test to finish. That'll be on chapter 10 and chapter 13. So a lot of stuff to get through. And with that in mind, we're going to hop right into it. Here we go. All right, there we go. All right, let's go ahead. We've still got a couple of people coming in. You know. All right, let's get started. Chapter 10.1. Right, so this one's kind of a hard one. It's sort of buried in the lecture notes for chapter 1 or for chapter 10, part 1. Um, so collective unconscious is an idea from Jung, Carl Jung, shared inherited reservoir of memory traces from our species history. So this is kind of where we get the idea um, of like archetypes, because we have sort of these collective shared memories across cultures, across times. Even the example they use here is like across memory or across species. So you have these mother-child relationships that form very strong bonds. We have very strong emotional connections to them, and that's true pretty much whatever culture you're in, and even what kind of animal you are. Yeah. He also had the sort of the Jungian version of the personal unconscious, which is slightly different to Freud's. All right, talking about Freud's psychosexual stages. Between the phallic stage and puberty, you have this latency period. Okay, so if you go from being um, sexually focused on yourself to sexually focused on other people. That's basically according to Freud, the idea there, switching between those two different points of focus. It lasts from age 6 to age 18, and it's just kind of a time where you are personally developing and just like enjoying being a kid for a while before all that stuff kicks back into gear in the genital phase later on. So that is false. Okay, so birth order would be more associated with a guy called Alfred Adler. So he was a contemporary of Freud's, one of the first sort of pseudo-Freudians, neo-Freudians, who took some of Freud's ideas and said, I agree with some of this, but not this stuff over here. Karen Ornight would be more the parent-child or child-caregiver relationship was the thing that she was the most focused on. She was also a big feminist, so like Freud's idea of like penis envy, she was not a huge fan of. So while some of her work undoubtedly definitely like crossed over a bit with Adler's and talking about birth order, Ornight's primary focus was the child caregiver relationship. All right, so agitation is not one of the defense mechanisms. Defense mechanisms, these coping tools that your ego uses to rationalize conflicts between your id and your superego. So you kind of have your just id, which is pure desire, and then your superego, which is your conscience, conscience. Yeah, there we go. Sort of where you get feelings of like guilt and I shouldn't do this from, whereas your id is like I want to do this all the time. So a defense mechanism is something that will be employed by your subconscious to figure out how to rationalize that tension or even resolve that tension. So regression, sublimation, and repression are all examples of defense mechanisms. Agitation is not, even though this whole process is certainly quite agitating. Right. So your preconscious level, this is where the iceberg illustration is particularly helpful. So you can see the conscious is the stuff that we see on the surface. The preconscious is the stuff just below the surface that we don't quite have on our radar currently, but very easily could be. It's similar to the idea of implicit memory, which we talked about, but it's a little more. I think that the preconscious is right now directly affecting what is going on in the conscious, as is the subconscious, but the subconscious is a little bit deeper and is a lot more difficult to access and probably won't be accessed without um, some type of therapy, which would have been where Freud came in. All right, so when we talk about the structural model, we're talking about the id, ego, and superego. Unconscious and preconscious, all that stuff is a similar idea, but that is not technically what we would file underneath the structural model. It has another name, which we can go back to, but I can't remember it right off the top of my head. So we have these two extreme camps when it comes to personality development. Not everybody is going to fall into the extremes. In fact, most people aren't. But like over here, we have the humanists who are like, personality development behavior is 100% in the hands of the person, and free will and self-determination are both really important factors in like how people choose to behave, and they have the choice to behave. Whereas Freud would have been like, yeah, your past experiences in childhood and relationship with your mom or whatever um, is pretty much the biggest and maybe even the sole thing that drives your personality development and your behavior. So he was very interested in the unconscious, that very deep level of the iceberg that we don't consciously have access to, but that still affects how we think and how we behave and who we marry and stuff like that. Parent-child relationships. Good job. You guys were paying attention. So Karen Ornai, German lady, she was very interested in how that parent-child relationship developed, and if it didn't develop the way that it would, ideally develop, you could create this thing called basic anxiety. And the way that you could resolve that basic anxiety would be to move towards people, move away from people, or kind of move over people. So sort of be this dominant personality, sort of a reverence that would help you, feel that belonging that you didn't receive from your parent figure. All right. There's a couple of layers to this question, and I'll try and explain all of them. A fixation in the anal stage. So what is the anal stage? Anal stage is one of Freud's psychosexual stages of development. Anal stage is about resolving potty training, basically. So learning to either control your bodily functions or to not control them. Okay. So how does that, according to Freud, that fixation present itself in adult behavior? So you're going to go one way or another. You're either going to be very focused on order and maintaining control to the point that we would might describe somebody as being anal retentive, which might be a thing that you've heard before. But the other option is being anal expulsive, which is basically just being an agent of chaos and not caring at all about cleanliness or perfection or control, and just doing whatever you want, being hedonistic, what have you. Okay. So the other option here, become overly dependent upon others, gullible and perpetual followers. So that's not quite what we're talking about with the anal stage. Anal stage is just about controlling your urges, basically. And it's true. So a lot of Freud's books, which there were many, came from information that he learned from patients, many of whom were already mentally ill. So that was a big thing with Freud. He had them because at that point, there weren't that many treatments for people who were mentally ill. So if you had symptoms of schizophrenia, what they would probably do in the early 20th century would be like remand you to what they would have called an asylum or a sanitarium, whatever. Freud was one of the first people to actually do what we would consider like talk therapy today, and like have people process out their feelings and emotions and try and get at all of that stuff that he thought was going on in their heads. And from those interactions is where he formed all of his grand sweeping theories about like the psychosexual stages of development, all that sort of stuff. The issue with that is that a lot of the information he was using was not from neurotypical people. So we are people who already, we would say, were struggling with mental health symptoms. And it was a pretty small sample size, so this was not from a huge group of people. And case studies, as we mentioned before, are highly subjective and difficult to draw big conclusions from. All right, so what defense mechanism is this representing? All right, so this is projection. This is if you have a, so let's say you're in a situation, may or may not be autobiographical, where your id, so your desire, your pleasure principle is saying, I'm not going to study. Instead, I am going to go to the movies. Okay. So your superego in that situation would be saying, no, you need to stay home and study because we have a test. So to try and resolve that tension, let's say you go to the movies, you could project that tension onto someone else, which in this case is me. So you can say, I failed because my teacher hates me. So that is projecting your attention between your id and your superego onto something external or someone external. You could also deny it. You could rationalize it. In this case, we were talking about projection. Right. Which defense mechanism do we also call blame shifting? Give you a hint, we just talked about it. Projection. Yes, this is saying this is not my fault. It's their fault. I'm shifting blame from me to somebody else to make myself feel better. Priming stage. Okay, so the oral stage, latent stage, anal stage, all the thing. And there is a P in that group, but it is the phallic stage. I would prefer that it be priming because that's a way less weird word. But sadly, it is not. Right, so there's an argument to be made for a couple of these, but we are learning about this in a particular unit and chapter. Should give you a hint. This is your personality. So the example they use here as your graphic, which I think is a very good one. If you've ever read The Cat in the Hat, which you probably have, it might have been a while. The whole premise is of The Cat in the Hat is these two kids are stuck at home one day because it's raining outside. And they have this visitor, the Cat in the Hat, that comes in and tries to get them to do all these irresponsible things, fun things, but irresponsible things. And then they have the fish who's trying to get them to not do those things and protect the house because their parents will be coming back later. So in this case, the cat is the id. Okay, so the cat is, trying to just incite chaos. He's just like all about desire and just not worrying about the rules, just doing whatever he wants. And then the superego, the fish, is the conscience, is trying to get these kids to understand that their actions have consequences and that they should feel guilt about potentially messing up their house, things like that. Hold on. Check for a second. Okay. All right, moving on. Do we call identification? So this is attaching to something positive. This is where we, a lot of our discussions previously about observational learning and role models and things like that come into picture, because we're talking about identifying with someone else and sort of incorporating their personality traits into our own, to try and resolve that tension between the id and the superego. This is regression. Okay, so if you've ever heard of somebody acting like a child, throwing a temper tantrum because they're upset about something or they feel guilty or something, like this is regression. This is going back to an earlier stage of development to try and make yourself feel better. Sometimes it works. So this happens in the phallic phase. So theoretically, when we're like from age like 3 to 6, your conscience starts to develop. You start to feel guilt about your actions. My mom is an elementary school teacher. I've been around a lot of kids this kind of age. I'm not so sure about that. In my experience, they are little terrorists who don't really care about what they do, and just do whatever they want. But that's what Freud says. Guess we got to go with it. Right, so when we talk about the genital stage, we're talking about the last stage of psychosexual development. It goes from puberty to death. So it's by far the longest lasting one, hopefully. So this one down here, coping with incestuous sexual feelings, this goes back to our Oedipus complex. I'm not going to explain that one fully, but that is what that is referring to, which is a thing. But in genital stage, in this case, we're talking about the last stage of psychosexual development. He was known for a lot of things, but what is the main one? Believing that personality develops through a series of stages. So that was his big contribution. Also, his belief in the subconscious, in the unconscious. Right, so defense mechanisms help us, like it says, defend the self against perceived threat. What that really means is they help us to make ourselves feel better if we're feeling something like guilt, some sort of tension between our id and our superego. A defense mechanism helps to sort of ease that a bit. There's a lot of different types, but all of them are trying to get to that same goal where we don't feel that tension, because tension is hard. It's the pleasure principle. Its whole thing is basically, I want this thing, I need it now. Okay, there's not a whole lot of time for nuance or patience with the id. It's governed by the pleasure principle, saying, I have this need, I need that need to be gratified, I need to do things that will help me gratify that need. A lot of times we think about the id, we think about irresponsible decisions. That's not always the case. Because it does, it's the first thing that develops. It's the oldest part of the structural model. Because when you're a baby, you just like need to eat and sleep and poop. And that's your id driving those needs, according to Freud. But yeah, it's governed by the pleasure principle. Birth to 18 months. It's the first one. So thinking about an oral fixation, something that might, behavior that might pop up later down the line if you didn't resolve this tension, would be something like smoking or drinking or excessive talking, things like that. A lot of stuff to do with the mouth, because the oral stage is focused around weaning, getting to the point where you figure out how to like chew and stuff. Like the ego is the referee basically between the id and the superego. Because if we have the id, just pleasure principle, it's just like got all these needs all the time, and the superego is trying to sort of go the other direction and introduce some more rationality to the situation. The ego, which is governed by the reality principle, we have to make a decision between those two things. So the ego is the one in between. Ego just means self. This isn't ego in the sense that we think about like somebody having a big ego. Uh, in this case, we were talking about the thing that decides between, okay, well, do I do what I want or do what I do? Do I do what I should? What is psychoanalysis? I've been talking about it this whole time. Behavior is due to unconscious thoughts. Okay, that is kind of Freud's whole thing. Yeah, really, the unconscious element is the key thing about psychoanalysis. Because if you've ever seen like, in a TV show or something like a psychiatrist's office, and you've got a patient client, reclined on a couch, and you've got somebody sitting next to them saying, how does that make you feel? That is sort of a cartoon level representation of psychoanalysis, which is trying to get down to that lowest level subconscious thought to explain current behavior. That is was kind of Freud's whole thing. Thing that he invented, developed, wrote a whole bunch of books about. Last one. Hey, Doug. Memories underneath the surface, easily recalled. So again, that sounds somewhat like implicit memory, which we talked about in our memory unit. Yes, that is correct. It's something that is quite similar. Preconscious is something that is not immediately in our conscious awareness, but very easily could be. All right, let's see. Made to the podium. Good job, Kathleen. All right. Cool. All right, so part one is done. We are going to take a 5-minute break and come back at 9:26, and we're going to finish chapter 10, get all the way through to the end. If Lord willing and the creek don't rise. All right, I'll see you guys in a few minutes.
Dr. Shingleton?
Yes.
I had a quick question. I sent you an email a couple weeks back.
Yep.
It was about the test.
Yeah.
I ended up taking the test and it was fine this week.
Good.
But there was also a couple other concerns in my email, but I was just wondering if I should email you separately about those.
Yes, please do, because I've gotten a lot of emails specifically about the test and test related stuff. So if that's still an issue, please, yes, do email me and I will get back to you as quickly as I can.
Okay, I'll just email you this afternoon then.
Great.
Thank you.
Oh wait, Mr. Shingleton, I have the same question too.
Yeah.
So my test submitted halfway through, and I emailed you like, I think around Sunday at some time,
Mm-hmm.
and it's been halfway through, and it gave me a really bad score.
Mm-hmm.
And so, is there like any way I can retake it?
Yeah. So I'll go back in. I'll do what I've done for other folks who've been in the same situation, and I'll clear that attempt. And unfortunately, you do have to take it all the way back over again. I wish that I could just like have you pick up where you left off, but I don't think I can.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you though.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else? All right, cool. I'll log off and then come back to this same link in a couple minutes.